Hi, I'm Dr. Martin Rutherford. I'm a certified functional medicine practitioner, chiropractor since 1979.
Dr. Randall Gates, board certified chiropractic neurologist, also a chiropractor.
And we endeavor to keep you up on the newest of new literature relative to the types of conditions that we treat. For those of you who are not familiar, or for those of you who have not seen one of our presentations before, I'm a functional medicine practitioner. Dr. Gates is a board certified chiropractic neurologist. And we put these two disciplines together and have kind of evolved into a chronic pain practice or chronic condition practice. So we share with the public what we see based on what our clinical experience is, based on what we do, and based on successful cases and what's working. We also, Dr. Gates does an enormous amount of research. That's kind of what he does for fun. And so he's continuing to, I forget what the term was that you used down there when I said this is new, but it was
the plot thickens.
The plot thickens. The plot thickens because we keep tweaking and tweaking and tweaking and fine tuning, because so many of the, for example, chronic fatigue, which we're going to talk about, in fibromyalgia, so many of you go to so many different people and get so many different bits and pieces of what actually contributes to each of those. There's kind of the throw the darts at the wall kind of thing. Okay, well, is it your thyroid? Okay, it wasn't that. Is it your adrenals? Oh, okay, it wasn't that. Well, maybe it was your thyroid. Is it your blood sugar? Is it your stress hormones? Do you have Epstein-Barr virus? We live 30 minutes from the gentleman who basically developed the understanding of Epstein-Barr virus and its connection to chronic fatigue. And we're fully aware of the Epstein-Barr virus involvement and anemias and B12 deficiencies. And so we're pretty much aware of what causes chronic fatigue, because it's one of the conditions that our practice evolution brought us to. We started with fibromyalgia and naturally morphed into chronic fatigue because they were kind of one and the same. And chronic fatigue is difficult, and there's a reason for it. It's because thyroid, blood sugar, adrenal, stress, gut problems, B12 deficiencies, Epstein-Barr virus, anemia, these things all come into play. Chronic disease, those types of things all come into play as causing the chronic fatigue and contributing to the fibromyalgia. Within that framework, the plot thickened relative to fine-tuning certain aspects of what we were already seeing, but new data coming out on a genetic proponent relative to the genetics being altered by trauma, which we see people who come in here with brain trauma or emotional trauma all the time. And there turns out there's a uniqueness to being able to manage that aspect of their case, if that's part of their case. And that's what you're going to share with these folks today. It's entirely possible that this is probably the first place that you're going to be hearing this. So you're on.
So as Dr. Rutherford alluded to, we've seen all the variables associated with chronic fatigue. We found that a lot of the metabolic variables, from thyroid to mitochondria to Epstein-Barr, really seem to have a brain consequence. So a large part of the effect is on the brain.
Screw up your funnel.
And so
fatigue is here.
Exactly. And so we found that by addressing the neurological aspects, that's where we really had most of the breakthroughs with chronic fatigue.
Without doubt.
And in studying the brain physiology further, there's this phenomena called the HPA axis that you really need to be aware of. HPA axis stands for hypothalamus, pituitary to adrenal axis. So the hypothalamus is below your thalamus. That's why it's called hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is kind of like a central command unit for a lot of your hormones, because the hypothalamus talks to your pituitary gland, which is considered the master gland in the body, and it coordinates all of the hormones throughout your body. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary really work hand in hand. And so then the hypothalamus and the pituitary send little signals down to your adrenal glands for your adrenal glands to make hormones like cortisol, aldosterone, to keep your blood pressure up, to help you heal from infections, things of that nature, to run from a lion and have enough glucose to, run 200 yards as fast as you can, things of that nature. But when we look at the chronic fatigue patient population, typically they have what's termed low HPA axis function, which basically means your stress responses, even though many of you have been exposed to trauma, you feel as though you're under stress, your stress responses are actually low. What were you going to say?
Would it be correct that they would probably know that as adrenal fatigue or
Probably,
adrenal
yeah,
exhaustion
exactly.
or something like that? If you're alternative minded, you've probably heard those terms.
Great point. And really, adrenal fatigue, there are some components to it, but really it's this brain mechanism. It's this HPA axis. Now, the HPA axis, through the adrenal glands making cortisol, the cortisol feeds back up to the brain, namely the hypothalamus, so that you have this kind of thermostat on this mechanism. It's called basically a feedback loop. And so theoretically, if your cortisol is low, then your hypothalamus should tell your pituitary to send more signals to your adrenal glands to make more cortisol. But that's obviously not happening in the chronic fatigue patient population. So the question, and this is seen lots of times in fibromyalgia patients too. So the question is, why? And then just for some perspective, when we look at depression and anxiety, which are also major problems facing a lot of our patients who come in really separate for that, and some of you have depression with chronic fatigue, they can overlap. But most of the time, not all the time with depression, for example, the HPA axis has heightened activity. So there's more cortisol, so to speak, than there should be. And then when there's high cortisol, even the brain and the hypothalamus don't sense accurately how high the cortisol is. So you just keep producing these high levels of cortisol. And then in this group of patients who have depression and anxiety, the high levels of cortisol feed back and actually damage the frontal lobes as well as the memory area of the brain, termed the hippocampus. And because the hippocampus is right next to the fear center, the hippocampus kind of like shrivels like a grape, and the fear center, the amygdala, starts to enlarge and invade the territory of the hippocampus. So that's part of the depression physiology. Now, just know that over time, the depression physiology eventually can lead to an HPA axis, a low functioning, but that's a little more detail than you probably need. But that's the background. So going back to the question, why do chronic fatigue patients and fibro patients lots of times have low HPA axis function? Why is it low? One of the new areas of research is showing that your genetics may have been altered by previous traumas and early life stressors. Namely, most of the research is showing with chronic fatigue patients is that there's this little gene in your hypothalamus. It's called the NR3C1 gene. Most of you don't care about that. Some of you will care about that. So go Google it. Now, the NR3C1 gene is a glucocorticoid receptor gene amongst many other things. So it coordinates little receptors for cortisol to come out and poke into the area where it can sense cortisol. And so if there's abnormal methylation, now methylation is going to be a word that may be above some of your heads. I don't mean that negatively. Just know that it's a way that genes are turned on or turned off. You can think of it that way. So the methylation for this gene is abnormal. It's low in a lot of chronic fatigue patients. They also see this in a lot of PTSD patients as well. And this is huge because it's thought when there's low methylation of this gene, actually the sensitivity of the receptor can increase, and therefore your HPA axis can become low because of that. Now that may seem complicated, and it is, and unfortunately I can't even distill it more than that because it actually gets even more complicated than that. And there's not necessarily universal agreement on the hypomethylation and hypermethylation between different disorders, like how early life stress may predispose somebody to depression. Because we do know that early life stress predisposes people to irritable bowel syndrome, anxiety, depression, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome. And there's a huge, huge correlation between early life trauma. And so when we talk about more like the PTSD aspect and fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. So that's very, very important. So the current information that we have right now, and we'll try to keep you updated on this as more and more information comes out on this, is that basically this gene is abnormal in patients who have chronic fatigue syndrome and probably fibromyalgia too. And we also see this in PTSD patients as well. And because this gene is not functioning right, your cortisol receptors are not functioning right in your brain, which causes the HPA axis to become low. What that translates into meaning for you is that this can be a big part of your fatigue. And a lot of you will be taking adrenal supplements because of your adrenal fatigue, which you'll have to keep taking forever until the underlying other neurological consequences are dealt with. And what we see in a lot of our chronic fatigue patients is that they still have a heightened activation of the amygdala. So their fear responses tend to be still abnormal because of the early life trauma, or we see that their frontal lobes are not functioning well in order to shut off these fear-based responses. And by taking people through neurological rehab, trying to address this HPA axis function, we're seeing some pretty cool results. So that's how I would say it. What did you want to impart?
Yeah, and that, I mean, and I was going to go back to the part we said there's controversy as to among different factions as to whether this is happening or not, or whether it's this or that. And I was going to say, how does that translate? Where people are coming here, there's a lot of heavy data going on in this presentation, but people are coming here to say, okay, well, there's controversy. What do I do with that? And you just started to say, you just started to talk about that. Mm-hmm. It's actually a brain problem. All these things are a brain problem. Depression's a brain problem. Frontal lobe. Anxiety is a brain problem. Frontal lobe. It's not a personality disorder. And when you start getting off into genetics, people start thinking, well, is there anything that can be done about that?
Right.
And what I was going to say was, first of all, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but these adaptocrines for these adrenal fatigue patients are really made for patients. Aren't they really made for patients who are like under like normal stress,
right,
as opposed to the post-traumatic type of stress syndromes that,
right,
that you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that Dr. Gates, and he's being, what we're trying to do is bring to you here what we've seen based on the new data and based how to go about it. So as a functional medicine practitioner, trust me, I mean, before we got together and we started doing the brain, we were using adaptocrines. And, you know, I thought maybe I didn't know what I was doing because they weren't really happening that much in these types of cases. But we didn't realize at this time, at least I didn't, what these types of cases meant. And these types of cases meant that the types of things that Dr. Gates is talking about put you in like post-traumatic stress syndrome. When he talks about your fear center enlarging, it comes down to this. Something programmed your fear center in your brain, some trauma, could be physical trauma too,
yeah,
could be a concussion, but more frequently, it's an emotional trauma, physical, verbal, sexual abuse, had a bad childhood, those types of things. And this amygdala, it's like it never wants you to forget that again, so that you're like never getting that involvement. So it just like programs it, and then eventually it gets bigger, like you say, it gets into the hippocampus. Hippocampus sits right next to it. That's where your memory thing is. Okay, so in the end, though, we're trying to use adaptocrines for that. Okay, it's a brain problem. It's a brain problem. In the functional neurologist world, are they still calling it chiropractic functional neurologists? Not to be controversial.
They call it functional.
I know there's a lot of non-chiropractors taking it now, like there's medical doctors taking it and physical therapists taking it and stuff like that. So whether you want to call it, whatever you want to call it, this discipline came about to treat dizziness, vertigo, balance, migraines, things of that nature. And they were the first ones to grasp that most of these patients were in post-traumatic stress syndrome. No matter what it was, whether it was trauma, whether it was other things affecting this gene. And so the point being that there is a solution. I think the whole point of this is, yeah, there's new data involved as to how the thyroid, blood sugar, adrenals, got all these different types of things. And this particular aspect of the adrenals and that stress response is significant because Dr. Gates has used these to determine if there was hyperactivation of the hypothalamus versus hypoactivation. It's helped direct this treatment. He's modest when he says we've gotten some pretty cool results. The point is, the results came because we weren't using adaptocrines that are designed for everyday stresses. That in our evolution, we came to understand that most of our patients had post-traumatic stress syndrome. All of these factors affect frontal lobe function, and this one fine-tunes things. We go back to the plot thickens. This is the plot thickening. Dr. Gates's research is continuing to fine-tune aspects of the adrenal glands. Why? The fact that you can have hypoadrenal function, the adrenal fatigue, and still have adrenaline function going off of the charts, and all these different aspects of it. This relative to handling the adrenals. And I say that for those of you who are invested in the alternative world. You've had an adrenal function test. You go, oh, my adrenals were like in stage 4. There's way more to it than that. Basically, the patients are taught control the blood sugar and give you adaptogens and other things like that. But
that's a great point.
This is fine tuning it dramatically.
Because people think genetics is just I'm screwed. My genetics are screwed up. I'm screwed up. Well, here's the point. Your genetics got altered by these events.
Right.
But the other point is, so can you maybe change your genetics by changing the other circumstances in your brain?
And the answer is yes.
Yeah, and those studies haven't been done, but that's what we're seeing.
But we're seeing it.
And so really, most of you may be wondering, okay, so how does this really work? Really, it works by what Dr. Rutherford said. First objective is shutting off the amygdala. Whether you have chronic fatigue, whether you have depression, whether you have anxiety, whether you have fibromyalgia, whether you have irritable bowel syndrome, you have to shut off that amygdala. Because until you do that, you have no foundation to build your house on. And then from there, you have to work to strengthen different areas of the frontal lobes that may or may not be working to help keep that amygdala in check. Then you have a baseline. We have a lot of chronic fatigue patients that come through. We start doing this and they get more fatigued. Well, you know what? That's actually good because we're calming down this amygdala, because this amygdala was still driving stress responses that was screwing up their genetics.
Yeah.
That's what we see, most likely. And then after we fix that, then we can go back in and start reprogramming your HPA axis with certain herbs, botanical supplements. But lots of times you have to do things that are more powerful than adaptogens, because I've seen exactly what Dr. Rutherford saw many years ago in terms of these adaptogens. They work for normal stress, absolutely, but they're like pissing on a forest fire, I'm sorry, for the problems that a lot of you present with. And what we see is that our patient population is getting more complicated. Why? Because everybody's trying the paleo diet. Everybody's changing this, they're changing that. So they've come in already trying so many things and that haven't worked. And if those things haven't worked, usually it's the stress mechanism and other variables of the autoimmune system that are causing you not to recover fully.
That's better. So now I think we lifted your brain fog on this. On this topic.
But this is exciting. And this is really exciting.
Yeah, and to help you to understand why maybe you're trying different things that aren't working, and these are complex issues, and they require people who understand how to assimilate this data and put it to use in a clinical setting. Because listen, none of this data there's data attached to this presentation
on powerhealthtalk.com.
On powerhealthtalk.com, but none of that matters if you can't get in a clinical setting and help that person to get to a point of stability and stay at the point of stability. And these are the things that are going to need to continue to come out, to be addressed. They're going to need to be addressed more globally in the functional medicine field. Functional neurology is going to have to expand. I don't know what we're going to do in the medical field, because the medical field is really not for this. The medical field is really for acute problems, not anti-medicine or anti-medicine. That's just a fact. We don't use drugs, and we do work with we do work with medical doctors, but in the end, the more research is being done, the more it's coming down to you can change brain function, you can use certain diets, but specifically to you, things can be done about this, and it's good for you to know that it's the brain. If you have fatigue, it's the brain. Your brain doesn't have no blood sugar, it doesn't have proper thyroid function, or giving it proper oxygen, that poor gut function. But this stress response, you have depression, or you have anxiety, or you have panic attacks, I will guarantee you it's there. If you have chronic fatigue, I will guarantee you that's there, and you probably have a thyroid problem too, but that's a subject for another day. So, okay?
That's good.
All right. All right, so have any questions? Feel free to send them to him.
No, we're not doing questions anymore.
I just thought I'd throw that in there and see if he was awake.
We're getting thousands of questions a week, so I'm sorry we can't do it.
Can't
you have a topic you want us to talk about, please send it to us.
Okay, there you go. All right.
Thank
For
you.
those of you who watch every week, we'll see you next week.
Yeah.
And for those of you who didn't, I hope you enjoyed that. Okay.